अस्सलाम वालेकुम दोस्तों, उम्मीद है कि आप सब सही होंगे। आई होप यू गाइस आर ऑल वेल। आज का हमारा जो शो है वो है प्रोग्रेसिव एक्सेप्ट पैलेस्टाइन। इसके क्या मायने हैं? वेल, अमेरिका के अंदर जहाँ पे बहुत सारी डिसीजंस ली जाती हैं मिडल ईस्ट के ऊपर और इजराइल और फ़लस्तीन के ऊपर, मकबूजा फ़लस्तीन के ऊपर, वहाँ पे ये एक नया टर्म निकला है, प्रोग्रेसिव एक्सेप्ट पैलेस्टाइन। इसके ये मायने हैं कि वहाँ पे बहुत सारे लॉ मेकर्स आर प्रोग्रेसिव ऑन अ लॉट ऑफ इश्यूज, बट जब फ़लस्तीन के ऊपर बात आती है तो वो जो उनका प्रोग्रेशन आप कह लें वो थोड़ा सा थम जाता है। इस मौजू पे बात करने के लिए वे जॉइंड from New York by Associate Professor of History at Brooklyn College, Louis Fishman, who is an expert on Israel and Palestine in the late Ottoman era. Louis, thank you so much for joining us. I know you have a busy schedule, but let's get straight into it. What do you mean by progressive except Palestine?
I would even start by saying that this is almost a no-brainer question or statement. For the last 100 years, I mean, way before even Israel became a state, already when it was the Jewish Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, we've seen a bias of, sort of a pro-American stance towards the Jewish community before it was a state and after it was a state. And it really hasn't changed over the last century if you look at it. And this is surprising if you look at the way it's transformed from being a more proactive member in the Middle East politics, whether this is the invasion of Iraq, whether this is the relations with Saudi Arabia. There's been a constant within Israel, and we can talk about today what's happening, that America is overtly biased towards Israel. And we see it especially now, I would say, that even when in Israel there are, we can talk about in a second, the huge divisions and there's protests taking part against the Netanyahu government. Obviously, the most fascist government Israel's ever seen. It's brought tens of thousands of Israelis out to the street, hundreds of thousands every week of Israelis out to the street. The United States still maintains its sort of the mantra it uses always: Israel has the right to defend itself. So yes, Israel has the right to defend itself. I think everyone would that's a very simple, easy statement to say. But when Palestinians are also being attacked by Israeli settlers or citizens, let's call them citizens because I think in the end they are citizens. And when you've had different numerous attacks on villages that are given the green light by some of the more radical voices in the government, the fact that America still hasn't really transformed, I think that speaks volumes.
For our viewers that might not know, explain to us from looking from the outside, when you talk of Israel, the perception is that all Israelis are Jewish and
Yes.
all Palestinians are Arab or Muslim. But it's a lot more complex than that, a lot more nuanced than that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, within Israel itself, Israel proper, that means not the West Bank, and of course not Gaza that they pulled out in 2005 and they maintain a blockade over. We're talking about within the 48 borders of Israel. It's about 80% Jewish, 20% Palestinian, or what Israel calls Israeli Arabs. I prefer to say Palestinian citizens of the state. Among them, the far majority do not do the army. They have a pardon from the army. Though you do have a small Druze community where they have to go to the army, the men, just like Israeli men, and they're quite small. But for overall, these are the Palestinians that remained within the state's borders following the 1948 Nakba, when you had the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from what would become Israel. Now, of course, that didn't include everyone. That included, that the Nakba was about 700,000. 100,000 remained in the state, and up until today, there, even with all the Jewish immigrations, leveling it out, they're about 20% of the population. Now, when we look at that, also they're not a monolithic group. Just like within Israel, the Jewish community is not monolithic, and we're actually really seeing this now with the protests where many of the people in Tel Aviv, maybe they're not left wing, and maybe this doesn't really reflect within the Palestinian Israeli conflict, with many of the left being actually well represented within the military. or the center and the center left, we see that there's major divisions within the Jewish society. So
So
getting
why?
back and getting back into what we're talking about is that, the United States, both within the U.S. Jewish community, that is overwhelmingly democratic. I mean, when I say Democratic Party, they're supporting overwhelmingly 80% support Biden compared to 20% supporting Trump. And there's many more groups. It's not a monolithic community where they
Yeah,
have
but
everyone supports Israel. Let me just finish here real fast. And there are groups in Jewish groups in America that are lobbying on behalf of the government, U.S. government, to do more for Palestine. And yet they still really aren't hasn't they haven't really shown any major shift despite this, I would say.
so basically, it's not a monolith as you said, but I think there's a little bit of nuance there as well. You said 80% might support the Democratic Party, but now you see another layer to all of this as well, where the younger generation of the Jewry in the United States is very critical of the policies of the current US government, which has remained silent as to what is happening in the occupied territories.
Yes, I would agree with you 100%. I mean, I teach at universities. I teach at Brooklyn College within CUNY, and I've seen this shift over the last 20 or 30 years. I myself was born originally in the U.S. I see a shift in the Jewish community where they are asking Israel hard questions. They are saying we want change. We want we want at least United States to work towards a two-state solution. Now, you could argue two-state solution, one-state solution. Is it viable? Is it not viable? But they want that the U.S. Stop being so biased, because due to this bias, nothing changes. I talk about it being what's happening now and the breakdown of any governance within the West Bank by the Palestinian Authority. I call this a self-fulfilling prophecy by the Netanyahu government. And what is it? What do I mean by this? Basically, you undermine the Palestinian Authority as much as possible. You keep Hamas always at a length distance where you can use them when you need them, or you go against them, right? There's, of course, they don't negotiate, and the two are arch enemies, but there are negotiations every time there's a ceasefire, right? But you undermine any system of governance within the West Bank, especially, and in Gaza to a great extent. And then you later say, oh, wow, we have to defend ourselves because there's a rise in terror, or there's a rise in militancy. Well, there's no other, today, there really is no other outlet for Palestinians to express their Palestinianness, right? So if you want to live and work and be submitted to the Israeli rule, remember the Palestine since 2007, and you could argue to extent before, but since 2007, there's no what we call peace process, right? There's really no active, or 2009, there's really no active peace process. So that's where it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? You're going to have a rise in attacks against Israelis, and Israel's going to retaliate. And then the U.S. jumps in and says, well, Israel has the right to defend itself. Well, once again, like coming back to the point, yes, they do have a right to defend themselves. But do you have a right to go into a refugee camp and
In
completely
Jenin,
demolish a whole Jenin, a whole neighborhood, at the cost of civilian life or civilian, and the U.S. do nothing in it? So
let's
that's
take
where
a
we say
step back.
progressive against everything Palestine, because you see a huge difference with Ukraine and other places.
Let's take a step back. Explain to us, what do you mean by one state solution, two state solution, and all of these terms? Do they even mean anything?
Yeah, I first of all, I think I usually try to not to enter the debate of one state or two states, because I say first we need to start talking. We have to have the sides talking and produce something together, right? Any outcome is going to, no matter whatever way you look at it, there's going to have to be dialogue between the two groups to reach into the conflict. This conflict has been going on since 1920. And you could even argue in the Ottoman period, I write how the dynamics of the Ottoman period, or how it already started. But the two ideas was from 19 37, the Peel Commission, when they decided to talk about partition of Palestine, that was going to be a two-state. And it's very much like the partition of India and Pakistan, also happening in 1947. The idea was that two peoples that are very different, ethnically, religiously different, they cannot live together. That's sort of a post-World War I, sort of, I would say, sad conclusion, right? The idea is that
Western consensus.
exactly. The idea is that Turkish and Greek people can't live together, so you're going to have to transfer Greeks to Greece and Turks, even though they only speak Greek, to Turkey, right? So this idea of population exchanges, the idea of partition. So the idea
And it
of
starts in the
partition,
1920s. It starts in the
1920s, it comes
1920s.
out. 1923, it comes out. 1937, the British propose the first division of Palestine into two states. And then finally, the 47, the United Nations partition of Palestine, which leads to the War of Independence for Israel. Israel becomes an independent state, miraculously. And
The Nakba, as the
and then
Palestinians call it.
Palestinians, they suffer the Nakba, which was the fleeing or the forced removal of Palestinians, and they weren't allowed to return. And that makes it ethnic cleansing. Very simple. It's not genocide, but it's ethnic cleansing, you would argue. So then now we have this idea of post 67. Once Israel occupies the West Bank and Gaza and post 67, that's when we get the two-state solution. And Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, really was a person that was much more pragmatic in, you could argue, in his early years, using terror tactics to reach a political goal, or using freedom fighting tactics, whatever which way you see it, to reach a goal. And finally, in 1993, the two sides come together, and they really looks like we're moving towards two states where Palestine and Israel are going to be right next to each other, and they're going to live peacefully in some kind of maybe open borders, maybe confederacy. There's different things like this you could find out, you could explore. But we know this didn't happen, and we know that after Rabin's assassination in 1995, that it really, and the rise of Netanyahu and what I can call Netanyahuism in a second, we see that they were at loggerheads again, and this leads to the second Intifada. Now, what is the one-state solution? The one-state solution is this idea that why do we need two states at all? Let Palestinians and Jews live together under one government, right? Under this idea that everyone will have the right to vote.
Which they technically are right now, basically.
Exactly. Technically are, but with Palestinians without the right to vote. So if they had the right to vote, it would be...
And the West Bank on the Israeli military laws.
Exactly. Well, yeah, well, now absolutely. Absolutely. They're in limbo between, the Palestinian Authority, but the largest voice is the military, right? Remember, Palestinians have no civic rights within their territories. When they go to prison, it's military. It's the military. The courts are military courts. So the idea that everyone would be a citizen is sort of a South African idea that this is an apartheid state. By the way, many more human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, are outright calling Israel an apartheid state today. Okay, and having said that, the United States is still not transforming policy towards this. I mean, the human rights
because you could be accused of anti-Semitism if you
do
call
and
Israel.
And that's the point. Well, I'll come right to that right now. So let me just real fast, quickly finish. But the one state, the idea of the one state, in my eyes, it would be almost next to impossible to reach. That's why I say dialogue is the most important, right? If we said only one state or we said only two states, we're not going to get anywhere, right? The idea is that some kind of dialogue has to come up. The idea that the Palestinian leadership is in the state, it is because Israel has created this also. Now, of course, Israel is not responsible for everything. You can never say, but overall, Israel's the one that's setting is writing the script. I would put it right. Israel is the
how is it not
strong
responsible?
Power that writes the script.
The counter to that is, or the question is, as the occupying power, isn't it a false equivalence then to say that the Palestinians also have to do things or to come to that, somewhere in the middle?
Well, that's
when there
exactly
isn't a
why.
middle.
Yeah, I agree with you, and that's why I say that you can't blame everything on the it would be like saying India and Pakistan are completely messed up only because the British, right? I mean, you can, and you hear that sometimes. Everything would be great if it wasn't for the British, right? Well, that holds true to a great extent, but each people are responsible for their own activities and in the end to a great
It
extent.
would
But
be
I
true
agree
if the
with you.
British were still
It's a false
occupying.
equivalency. I absolutely agree with you on that. It's a false equivalency. That's why. But I just wanted to put that out there. Now that the anti-Semitism or claims of it is very very important, and I'll tell you that my own academic work is I work on anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in the Ottoman Empire in the 1911 or 12. You're already conflating the two already in 1911 and 12, and it's already about these conspiracies of Jews taking over the world. Very anti-Semitic language is being developed during these years, and this sort of resonates well. So what we have is we have a part that yes, sometimes criticism of Israel is outright anti-Semitic. There's no doubt about that.
Like what? Such as what?
Well, when you draw photos of Jews that look much more like something done against them in Eastern Europe with blood on their hands and different things, when you single them out as being the worst, the most evil, right? That could be, and it really is every individual case. But the problem is that any criticism towards Israel often is interpreted as anti-Semitism, and that is outright wrong, right? Calling Israel out on crimes, war crimes, different things, is simply not anti-Semitic,
But
right?
isn't that what the new IHRA definition does, and what a lot of the U.S. lawmakers now subscribe to?
Yeah, absolutely, and that in itself would make many Jewish people anti-Semitic in this idea. The anti-boycott lines. I mean, where you have something
Or
like the
self-hating
boycott,
Jews?
divestment, sanctions, where they really haven't been, I would say, overall they're successful in different unions, raising some kind of political field for making it equal. The overall, they really haven't been that quite successful. On the other hand, when you have the United States, different states, whether it's Florida, Texas, I think, within New York at times, saying that you cannot boycott Israel, it does the exact opposite, right? It creates this sort of frustration among younger people that are now wanting to talk about it. And it's the silencing of voices on this. And that
Effective
certainly is
silencing. Effective silencing.
effective silencing, where you can have sanctions taken against your business or your job even within universities if you pursue this route. And we haven't. I don't think we've had any cases yet where these anti-boycott laws have been brought to courts or anything. But that's going to be
BDS.
something. That's going to be really something interesting to see because um, in today's Supreme Court, who knows might happen because we see that the Supreme Court has turned extremely right. So they actually it would be unimaginable to be able to be held up in Supreme Court just 3 years ago. Today, things are changing. So it's the silencing of voices, and I think that should bring us to an interesting point here. Is that often I find that the debate in the United States over Israel and Palestine actually has very little to do with Israel and Palestine itself. It actually has much more in the divisions within the United States, and each one trying to voice what they believe the United States should be by putting where they are in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Meaning
Okay, so then
they
let's pull back a bit. Let's pause here a bit for the
yes,
benefit. We're circling back to the U.S. here, right?
yes.
So you've got the Israel-Palestine conflict, you've got the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and in the United States, you've got their own stream, so to speak. The conservatives, the Zionists. Explain to our viewers what Christian Zionism is and how then it fuels this anti-Palestinianism where you can be progressive except Palestine.
Yeah, I mean that's a fantastic place to come back to because Christian Zionism
or
for up
not?
until the 50s or 60s, most religious Christians, many of them were highly anti-Semitic. They were the idea that they were going to become the greatest supporters of a Jewish state seems quite odd. And by the 1990s, we saw a shift in the United States where evangelical Christians started to adopt Israel as sort of a point to rally around and to gain new support. So you have on one hand a very secular Israel, a country that allows, for example, they have no civic marriages, but if you have LGBT rights, and if you get married outside of Israel, you can get registered as married same-sex couples. So you have a very sort of very open society. But on the other hand, the ones that are supporting Israel often are evangelicals that are coming from the most conservative parts of the United States. And sort of the idea for them is that, if once Israel becomes a state and that, that is going to lead to the second coming of the Messiah, where Jews are still waiting for the first Messiah. Christians, of course, are waiting for the second Messiah. This includes Muslims also. But the idea of Israel, of Jews returning there, is a very Christian idea. That's just
And once
going
they
to
return, it's the end of days. It's the Armageddon.
it's the end of days, exactly. So you have a
So
really strange dynamics that many of these people that you see that they're getting married with, they bring rifles to their weddings and gun power and the right to have guns. They're going to be staunchly pro-Israeli, okay, pro-Israel. But when they meet Israelis, they see that Israelis are very, very different than that. It's sort of this huge mismatch, and that was what Netanyahu was able to do in his earlier years. Netanyahu already in the 1990s realized how important this group was. So where you have liberal Jews in the Congress saying no, we don't think Israel should have a clear green light, you have evangelicals supporting everything they do. Now this has shifted in the last. I think this has sort of reached its peak with evangelicals, and I think it's actually on the down, going down, because suddenly you get a president like Trump who openly. I mean, he discriminates against everyone. I don't think equally, but he has said many anti-Semitic things, including other numerous racist comments against disabled people, different things like that. Right? He's sort of known for that. So I think this made a moment where we see that the right wing itself doesn't really know where it's going right now. So I don't think, and also APAC, the American Jewish Lobby, in itself is being criticized by many Israelis during the recent protest. So where they're welcoming Israelis, politicians, APAC, every politician that comes to the United States is literally followed by 100 people screaming shame, shame, shame for trying to transform the judicial coup of Netanyahu right now, right? So we're in a very strange moment. And if we bring it back to Israel and the pro democracy, pro democratic um, rallies that are taking place, is the hope is that even if they are heavily represented by people in the military, right? Even if they are heavily represented by the people in the military, that this is creating a shift among many Israelis saying, wait a minute, we need to go back and look at the Palestinian issue again. Because what Netanyahu promised for so many years, and I'll finish at this point, it's very important, is what I call Netanyahuism. Netanyahuism was the idea that you can minimize the conflict completely, you minimize it, and you balance it out with a very strong economy. Okay, and Israel had a booming economy from 2009 to 2019. Okay, and that's when Israel entered this. When Netanyahu was indicted the court cases are ongoing right now for corruption. Right, it led to 5 different elections within Israel, and it actually led to the opposition parties uniting together, these sort of radical right with the even an Islamist party and a strong center core. This failed and Netanyahu came back. And since Netanyahu is back, we call it the era, we could say it's the period of a judicial coup right now. He's trying to get all powers to his government, give him all power. So you see in something like what happened in
Louis,
Turkey
just
or
to
in
pull
Poland.
back a bit, and
Yes.
for the benefit of our viewers who are mostly in South Asia and Pakistan, your experiences growing up Jewish in the United States. You talk about bigotry, you talk about anti-Semitism. How did you experience all of this growing up in the US? And just to contextualize it.
Yeah,
First question.
personally, being that I was from a smaller town and I left at 18 and I never went back to where I'm from. I'm in New York only for my job, basically. And as you know, I lived in Turkey for many years. I lived in many years in Israel, and I vote in Israeli elections. We have to fly back. I vote. I see myself as that's where my allegiance is in terms of voting, at least in terms of voting. Whatever that means, that's a different thing. But yes, of course, if you're growing up in a smaller area, there is and regularly there's anti-Semitism. We see it on the rise in the United States. Just last week in near Atlanta, Georgia, they had neo-Nazis out protesting at a synagogue, you know, with Hitler signs and Nazi signs. So with the rise of Trumpism in the United States and white nationalism, I think the Jews are really feeling it here. There is no doubt that, remember, the Jewish population is not more than 5% of the overall population, but they're very urban, right? They're very, very urban. And that's what makes them so influential, the two blue states, both in California and New York, is that they are very urban, they are very educated. Although my family was a truck driver, for example, so they're not all they're not all working as lawyers or doctors. You have workers also, of course, but they are overall educated, right? And you have upward social mobility, so they've reached very, very high points. And I think within the Trump years, we saw where that was also peaking out, meaning that the backlash of them becoming so successful, not also within the realms of government, created this huge wave of anti-Semitism that we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years. And I think it's something very, very, it's very dangerous. And let me say that the irony also of anti-Semitism is often that's what caused Israel to be a self-fulfilling prophecy also. Meaning many times when, if you have the rise of anti-Semitism, let's say if we look in some of the Turkey where we see Europe, you'll see that not everyone's moving to Israel when they move because of anti-Semitism, but it's certainly one factor that they're thinking maybe we should move on, right? These are smaller communities in Europe, smaller communities in the United States, different things like that, where they see Israel as a place, as their homeland, right? Meaning, I live in Brooklyn, New York, so a lot of my students have family here and there. For them, Israel is not something political. It really is a place that half their family lives, right? So it goes beyond. It goes into personal ties, and when you get
And then it feeds into these tropes of dual loyalty.
Absolutely,
and
absolutely.
I can speak from a Pakistani perspective, and maybe you can close this off, round it off here.
Yes.
This idea that, and it's quite an anti-Semitic idea, that Jews control the media or Jews control the world. Tell us about that specifically and how it feeds into it in places like Pakistan or the Middle East or even India.
I mean, within the Middle East, it's over the top. This idea that Jews controlling everything, and this idea of it comes out of, I think, of a crisis of political control, or the lack of that, the politics. And it's very easy to scapegoat, this very, very small community and say that they control everything. But they don't. It's like calling the Rockefellers Jewish when they're not even Jewish, right? You start and not recognizing that many of the American companies were originally very anti-Semitic, like Ford Motor, Henry Ford, for example. So the idea that they're responsible for everything, and they have, nowadays we see, I think, a more nuanced idea, just because Israel in itself, because of the success of the UAE and other countries and creating ties with them, we see that Israel by far is not the only power in the Middle East. Yes, they are a strong power, but that power comes from a highly, once again, educated society, a society that is brought up in a school system that's teaching them to be. It's Israel probably the strongest point that it is an ideological state, which makes it its weakest point also. It makes it its weakest point in terms of coming to some kind of solution on the conflict, right? But it also makes them stronger. So even if you look at the GDP in Israel, yes, Israel gets billions of dollars from the U.S., but that money goes back in the U.S. It's go back in the U.S. and the Israeli economy is very vibrant. But now we're seeing, for example, within Israel, some of the people saying, you know what, if it's going to be a dictatorship, we're going to move our company out. This is Israelis. So we see this breaking down of this sort of a monolithic, strong Israel, right? And I think that is going to change things. But the anti-Semitism, definitely, if I'm looking at the 1912, these conspiracy theories of Jews, of the global power. I mean, Jews are inherently transnational. They, many of them, whether they're from Arab countries and they saw their fate that they were forced to leave eventually this way or that way, or Russian Jews, Ashkenazi Jews. And it was very common that you have one sister go to Buenos Aires, one to New York, and one to Israel, right? It's very common. Sephardic Jews from Turkey, one to Mexico, one to the U.S., one to France, right? So it was that created, I think, creates fears. This idea that they're everywhere but they're nowhere. But it really doesn't help, and the it really hinders a solution because
And the occupation feeds into this as well.
absolutely. And I'll say on two things. On one thing, on the local level, I want to say here in Brooklyn, for example, because so many people have family in Israel, then suddenly BDS does seem anti-Semitic to them because they're unable to separate, oh, we're American Jews versus this. No, we're half here, we're half there. Or we grow up there in the summers or something like that. That's something difficult. Now with the extreme anti-Semitism, it really it hurts Palestinians more than anyone else. And I mean, you have very strong Palestinian voices speaking against anti-Semitism because they know that muddies that muddies up the waters, right? It's a murky way. It creates a murky water where you're not sure what's what, right? So if we're constantly saying that's anti-Semitism, that's not anti-Semitism, right? You really should create a way of criticizing Israel that you think twice that this is not anti-Semitism. And if this claim is brought up against you, you should think maybe it was and I didn't realize it, or maybe this is just false. I know that's a lot to ask from people criticizing, a government that's occupying a people for 56 years now and occupied a land of a people before that, right? So I mean, for Palestinians, the whole thing is considered occupation. Now that's where a political solution was almost reached, right? And then but it didn't happen. So yeah, I think Palestinians themselves realize now. Remember, more Palestinians speak Hebrew than Jews outside of Israel. I think that's a very interesting thing, right? The Arabs in Israel who are Palestinian at least descent, right? Everyone can define themselves how they want to define themselves. They speak fluent Hebrew. They go to universities. So the Palestinians in the West Bank know Jewish people. They know good Jewish people and bad people. The average Palestinian in the West Bank only knows a soldier nowadays. But it wasn't like that in the 80s. In the 80s, when they were a cheap labor force, there was a lot of intermixing between the groups. Today, this doesn't happen. And that's part of the problems we're seeing today also. People just aren't meeting as much as they used to.
We had planned this session for 20 odd or 15 minutes, and now we're at 34 minutes. Louis Fishman, thank you so much for enlightening us on what it means to be progressive, accept Palestine in the US. You touched on so many topics on this, and we'll definitely have you back as this issue isn't dying out.
Yeah, exactly. And Ali, thanks so much for a great interview, and be well. And hopefully we'll meet here, there, or somewhere else.
Absolutely. Take care, buddy. Thanks again.
Bye bye.
So یہ تھا آپ کے سامنے لوئی فشمن, ایسوسیٹ پروفیسر آف ہسٹری ایٹ بروکلن کالج ایٹ سٹی یونیورسٹی آف نیو یارک, کیونی کہتے ہیں, یہ ہمیں جوائن کر رہے تھے. انہوں نے بڑے انٹرسٹنگ موضوعات کے اوپر بات کی کہ ہم نے اینٹی سیمیٹزم کے اوپر بات کی, ہم نے یہ بات کی کہ جی جو یہ اینٹی سیمیٹزم ٹروپ ہے کہ یہودی دنیا میں ہر چیز کو کنٹرول کرتے ہیں, اس کی کیا بنیاد ہے, اس کو یہ اتنا کیوں پھیلا یہ تاثر. آکوپیشن کا بھی اس کے اندر بہت بڑا ہاتھ تھا. انہوں نے بات کی کہ امریکہ کے اندر کئی ڈفرینٹ لیئرز ہیں, ایک مونولیتھک لیئر نہیں ہے کہ یہودی لابی ہے یا اسرائیلی لابی ہے, ڈفرینٹ لیئرز ہیں. یوتھ کا اپنا پرسپیکٹو ہے, ان کا اپنا ایک اس کے اوپر رجحان ہے. اسی طریقے سے اسٹیبلش جو پولیٹیکل گروپس ہیں ان کا ایک اپنا خیال ہے. اس کے اندر کرسچن زائنزم کا بھی آتا ہے کہ ہارڈ لائن کرسچن جو ہیں وہ اس ایشو کو کس طریقے سے دیکھتے ہیں, کس طریقے سے جانچتے ہیں. اور بیسکلی یہ جو پورا ایک سلسلہ چل رہا ہے جہاں پہ اسرائیلی آکوپیشن فلسطین کی, جہاں پہ جنین کے اندر اسرائیل نے ریسنٹلی دوبارہ اپنا انٹینسیفائی کیا اٹیک, ان سب چیزوں کو لے کے ایک سیلف فلفلنگ پروفیسی کی بات کی لوئی فشمن نے. کہ ایک طرف تو یہ کہتے ہیں کہ جی اسرائیل ایک بڑا کمپلیکس اسٹیٹ ہے جہاں پہ عربی زیادہ ہیبرو بولتے ہیں نسبتاً ان یہودیوں کے جو اسرائیل سے باہر رہتے ہیں, لیکن کیونکہ جس طریقے سے یہودیوں کے ساتھ پچھلے 100-200 یا 1000 سال کے اندر جو پھیلے ہیں وہ, یعنی ان کی فیملیز ٹوٹیں یا اور جگہوں پہ گئے, تو لائلٹی اگر ایک فیملی ممبر کی اسرائیل کے ساتھ ہے تو دوسرا بندہ اگر امریکہ میں رہ رہا ہے فیملی ٹائلز تو ان کی ہوں گی. اور اسی لیے یہ جو ٹروپس ہیں جس کا فائدہ تقریباً آپ کہہ سکتے ہیں اسرائیل بھی اٹھاتا ہے کچھ حد تک, ان ٹروپس کو فیڈ کرنے کے لیے کہ جی اگر آپ اسرائیل کو کرٹیسائز کر رہے ہیں تو آپ یہودیوں کو کرٹیسائز کر رہے ہیں یا جوڈیزم کو کرٹیسائز کر رہے ہیں آپ. تو یہ سب چیزیں بڑی کمپلیکس ہیں, بڑی نیوانس ہیں, اور لوئی فشمن نے اس کے اوپر بہت بات کی اور ہمیں بتایا کہ کس طریقے سے یہ چیز آگے بڑھ رہی ہے. مگر میرے خیال سے آج کے لیے اتنا ہی. اپنا خیال رکھیے گا اور ڈو سبسکرائب. ٹیک کیئر.